These are the remains of a UH1 Huey, the most produced helicopter in American history. Its adoption by the various US and Allied armed services coincided with the mass deployment of troops to Southeast Asia, in what became known as the Vietnam War, during which it was employed so extensively as to become one of the most recognizable pieces of machinery in history. It came to symbolize that conflict altogether. Some 4,000 of these aircraft were lost in Vietnam. Many of its wrecks still populate the jungles and rice paddies of that country. Ghostly trophies of a war long gone. They were lost along with the lives of more than 50,000 Americans, and up to 3 million Vietnamese, and countless millions more on both sides scarred and traumatized by that tragedy. The American presence and power in Indochina was gone for good. The war became very unpopular at home. It contributed to major cultural changes, and to the end of the unshakable belief in a just and dominant America that stood for 40 years since the New Deal. So in 1973, the US leadership retreated and delegated the fighting to their local allies. This precipitated the latter's defeat, that culminated with the fall of Saigon in 1975, where the Huey became once again the symbol of a debacle. Some 50 years on, there are tensions and fears again, and the nation is divided. One last time, the spectre of the Huey, along with monuments destroyed and centers of power stormed, returns to haunt America and warn of bad things that might be in the works. US electoral year 2024 and the subsequent second Trump administration came after decades of gradual political alienation and at least 4 presidential terms, including Trump's own first, characterized by hitherto unseen polarization, where elected administrations were considered not only as corrupt and ineffective, but also as illegitimate and tyrannical by increasingly large sections of society from the opposite camps. This led to various defamatory campaigns and personal attacks, and contributed to an insurrectional atmosphere and instances of civil unrest, where the forces of law and order had to withdraw, sometimes leaving major cities in a state of anarchy, where looting and theft were not addressed, occasionally leading to vigilantism. Institutions and offices were ignored, disobeyed, and even attacked. This state of discord was fueled by polarly opposite attitudes to major social, economic, and political issues, and involved attitudes to race, religion, gender, sexuality, policing, gun rights, immigration, foreign relations, etc. This has led many, including sober and objective voices, to speculate about the possibility of the deterioration of affairs to the level of an open armed conflict between 2 or multiple peer or near-peer factions, usually along the lines of big cities against deep America. Civil war had occurred domestically in the 1860s and countless times abroad, notably in Russia at the end of World War I, Spain before World War II, and China after it, as well as in various parts of the world ever since. Hello everyone and welcome to the Heavy Water D2O. In this video we will try to analyze the 2024 film titled Civil War, its contexts, meanings, and real-world implications. Civil War is a film set in an alternative present or very realistic near future, and centers around a group of old-school journalists, some of whom are writers and interviewers, while others are photographers who use film rather than digital. Towards the end of the story, we see television reporters from a rival crew, and we do know that the universe shown to us is technologically similar to our own. Nevertheless, oddly, our group has no one and nothing to record moving pictures and sound, unless we consider the fact that their journey is shown to us as a documentary, and that the film's own cameras and crews constitute that lacking media. By any means, the film is in big part a tribute to its director's Alex Garland's former career as a journalist, and to the journalistic profession in general, the work of which it documents. It reminds us of the many films and stories with journalists as central characters, a setup that makes the story more believable because of the blurring of lines between cinema and reporting, fiction and news. The story takes the form of that archetypical American theme, be it in horror, comedy, or existential drama genres. The urban or suburban middle-class family car journey through deep America, encountering hillbillies, rednecks, cowboys, and other odd inhabitants of the so-called flyover country. The structure of the family is initially unclear, and appears to be trigenerational, with two parents, a grandfather and a child, then a single mother, a grandfather and two children, before settling in its final and most important form. There are two mature characters, respectively representing a father figure and a mother figure, both called rational, professional, and fully desexualized. The latter being quite an acting feat in the case of Kirsten Dunst. There also are two immature and emotional, adolescent-like characters, with a brief and failed courting side story between them, following which they assume the role of siblings. Ultimately, the parents sense death approaching, have fears and self-preservation instincts, but instead decide on the greater good and die, each sacrificing themselves and saving the same gender child, while the children take their place and become adults, each successfully filling the professional role of the same gender parent. The film is thus a journey across space and across time, where the heroes travel through deadly obstacles and overcome vicious monsters, making great sacrifices, passing their torches to the upcoming generations that attain maturity, and complete their predecessor's mission by slaying the lurking dragon who presides over evil. Of course, there's a character with the ever-present initials JC, that in the culmination of the story rises as the second coming of its sacrificed alter ego parent. Despite the fact that we spend the length of the story with such an assembly of educated and knowledgeable people, who should be ahead of others in understanding events and processes, the conversations are rather technical, as would be between tradesmen discussing their job, and no insights into the conflict are gained, apart from a brief listing of several potential questions by the patriarch, who by the way bears a striking resemblance to the depictions of ancient philosopher Socrates. These questions are nevertheless still pedestrian. We however gather that the views of the journalist protagonists come across as being rather liberal, perhaps leftist, in the long tradition that tends to dominate in Western journalism, and includes the likes of Ernest Hemingway and Seymour Hersh. What is sure is that they don't give the impression of being in line with journalistic impartiality, and that has serious implications not only on the storyline, but also on the effect that the film might have on the spectator. The story opens in New York, still controlled by the United States and its unpopular and tyrannical president, who somehow managed to sit an unconstitutional third term. Prolonging power in nominally and even actually democratic systems is something that had been done repeatedly and by use of various legal technicalities and illegal tricks. Furthermore, we learned that the president had dissolved the FBI, something that surprisingly to many generated discontent in those opposing him, including the protagonist's liberal journalistic crew. This comes across as a strange reaction that is only if we choose to forget that the FBI is supposed to be an independent agency, and that as such it might have opposed some really unconstitutional or illegal actions that the president's administration might have been committing. Or if we don't assume that in a state that was breaking apart, it simply picked sides and aligned itself against the president's regime. Furthermore, and in a way reminiscent of the Spanish and Syrian civil wars, the president's forces have been bombing their own citizens using air power. Throughout the journey, we see a broken country. The infrastructure is heavily damaged. We see something resembling the death road of Kuwait 1991 fame. There are severe oil shortages and power cuts. New York's inhabitants are compelled to cycle for transportation. The dollar is worthless, and foreign currency is used as a more reliable tender. The cities represented by New York are scenes of street riots, heavy-handed police repression, and subversive political violence reminiscent of that of nationalist, communist, and Islamist movements, with one scene showing the course and aftermath of a suicide bombing attack. Throughout the country there are plenty of refugees, and aid agencies try to help them with food and shelter, including inside the stadium, which reminds us of these having served as detention points during past military coups. A strange moment in the film occurs when the crew visits a town that doesn't seem much affected by the hostilities, and one of the journalists expresses shock at that. This ignores the fact that in most wars, and for that matter civil conflicts, the majority of people attempt to live their lives ordinarily, to the best of their capacity, and thus tend to create an air of normalcy about them, as was shown throughout countless conflicts. Think Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, or the Miss Sarajevo contest during the Yugoslav Civil War. This is especially true if the conflicts become long-lasting, and we know that this one is, with one time clue being the abandoned winter park having long outlived its season. Another anomaly is that the group of journalists is initially based in territory controlled by the hated US government, and try to go to another territory also controlled by the same government, while driving mainly through areas portrayed as aligned with it. Yet all the trouble that they find comes in the form of militias supporting that very same government. Couldn't clearance permits and escorts be arranged? Aren't the ethnic minority and foreign journalists aware that ethnic cleansing is taking place, and that they will surely be targeted? Couldn't they be embedded with government forces when reporting from that side, as they seem not to have suffered persecution while in government-controlled New York? Outside of the cities in flyover country, there are local militias, whom we recognize as being on the president's side, because they consist of white men who sit around with rifles and wear baseball caps, not unlike MAGA hats, and apply ruthless and disproportionate Old Testament justice for crimes committed out of need. Farther away, the journalists get shot at by an entrenched mass shooting type sniper, and then have an unlucky encounter with racist redneck militiamen who are in the middle of committing war crimes, possibly genocide, as they pick victims according to race and ethnicity, with multiple seemingly civilian black people among the dead in the common grave, people being shot outright based on physical racial characteristics, places of origin and accents. Thus, the younger writer character played by a Brazilian actor, with the character being presumably Cuban American, gets called Central American and is lined up for execution upon speaking in slightly accented English and stating that he is from Florida. We learn that the US government is opposed by several rival entities: the Florida Alliance in the south, the New People's Army in the northwest, and the Western forces composed of California and Texas, who seceded from the US and are waging a winning war against it. The loyalist US forces have been losing territory, and the Western forces and allies are closing in on Washington, D.C. and the President, something not unlike the Allied race to Berlin in 1945. If so, it is possible that upon the fall of the regime, the factions may turn against each other, as happened between the Western Allies and the Soviets during the Cold War. Civil wars as well as other conflicts are sometimes fought between two distinct entities, such as in the US and Chinese civil wars. In other instances, there are various factions and sides that are either allies or temporary co-belligerents in the face of what they see as the greater evil. Such was the situation in the Russian, Spanish, Lebanese and Syrian civil wars, and must be the situation in this particular conflict, which helps us to understand why the traditionally conservative South is opposed to the president's regime and is controlled by an alliance centered in Florida, a state with several large minorities, that the racist militiaman considers to be un-American altogether. This alliance probably includes the black population of the wider South. It must be noted that that entity already has the word alliance in its name. The New People's Army sounds like a Maoist, Trotskyist, or anarchist force that grew from the radical movements that in our own timeline thrived in Seattle and Portland. Finally, there is the union of California with Texas, an idea that puzzled everybody who had seen the film. A very liberal state united with a very conservative one. But it might be that the secessionist power that controls the Western forces doesn't necessarily represent the majority of either state's population. As in most such conflicts, what matters is who the military give allegiance to. Or it is more likely that this combination of states shows that the Western forces, with this wide spectrum of political alignment, are the equivalent of our idea of a pluralistic American democracy, while the film's president-run US is something that has drifted far away from that, to become a tyrannical or fascist regime. The unnamed president is shown as a Donald Trump-like figure, and that is not only alluded to by his appearance, narcissism, and manner of speech, but also by the way his presumed supporter Thug says China, and is overtly hostile to it, to the extent of executing anyone connected to it, as well as the fact that Greenland is mentioned in the same category as Alaska when safe passage to neutral territory is demanded. Alaska is a US state originally purchased from Russia in 1867, while Greenland is a Danish territory. Why not then demand safe passage to Canada, or for that matter to Denmark itself, or any other country in Europe or elsewhere? It could be presumed that neither of those states would shelter the fleeing president, and that they might be sympathetic to the coalition fighting him. Greenland is specified because in this universe its status is the same as that of Alaska, and we do know that it was and still is in Donald Trump's intentions to purchase Greenland, and that Denmark has a history of selling territory to the US, having sold its Virgin Islands in 1917. They have since been known as the US Virgin Islands. So in this timeline, the Greenland purchase must have occurred. It might be that the film's subliminal message is that of Donald Trump being a tyrant who would cause or at least provoke something as terrible as a civil war. What agenda would that serve is easy to conclude because the film came out in an electoral year and might have contributed hostility against Trump's figure, who's seen by many opposing him as a diabolic entity, guilty of all sorts of evil, both actual and potential. So seeing his personification guilty of tyranny, genocide and war would subconsciously add to the negative perception of him that large sections of the population already had, and it thus attempted to negatively affect his electoral campaign and his subsequent presidency. Unlike what we see of the US forces and supporting militias that are fully made up of white males of the rural type, the Western forces consist of a well-organized modern army, as well as of militias, both of which are composed of males and females, with urban and multicultural backgrounds, including Asian and Black Americans. There are Antifa-type students fighting for their campus, and even what seems to be a homosexual couple, with pink-colored hair and painted nails, lying on each other while acting as a sniper-spotter pair, reminiscent of the Theban sacred band of antiquity. The warfare is hybrid, and ranges over a wide spectrum from protest and political violence, terrorism, guerrilla warfare, to modern combined arms that involves aircraft, helicopters, armor and artillery, as well as urban small squad tactics. There are no drones though, which is very surprising following the long recent wars in the Middle East and especially in Ukraine. And there is no mention of nuclear weapons. The warring sides have each managed to inherit part of the armed forces, but in the final stages of the campaign that the film shows, the president's US forces seem to be overwhelmed to the point of not posing a threat to the Western forces that concentrate nonchalantly without fear of being targeted by artillery, missiles, or aircraft. What strikes one in the film is that the arbitrary executions are not limited to those carried out by the based bad guys, but are committed with ease by the supposedly good guys too. Thus, in a firefight on a college campus, we see a wounded loyalist fighter being executed upon being reached, and 3 other gunmen being shot later. This doesn't occur out of hand, but after they surrender, have their hands tied, hoods put on their heads, and are led to a designated area for execution, in the prelude and aftermath of which the journalists fraternize and celebrate with the woke fighters. The immorality and unlawfulness of that is not discussed at all. What matters to the very superficial and businesslike journalists is their work, as well as the adrenaline rush that they got. Throughout wars, including civil wars, there have always existed laws and customs regarding prisoners, and it is almost universally accepted that surrendering and wounded fighters should not be executed. There are many grey lines when it comes to fratricidal conflicts, and or when dealing with so-called francs-tireurs, partisans, guerrillas, or other irregular enemy combatants. But the conventional rules of war tend to be applied. This is even more valid if the side that they surrender to claims to fight for justice or to possess the moral high ground. Of course, it is also accepted that if these surrendering fighters are accused of war crimes, or other crimes for that matter, they can be tried and sentenced, sometimes to death. But that involves a legal process, or at least a semblance of it. Knowing human nature, it is understandable that these laws and customs may at times, perhaps quite often, be disregarded, and that such executions do take place, but it is clear that in most cases these are deemed war crimes. Now, the fact that war crimes take place in the presence of journalists who not only document them but also celebrate with the perpetrators, and that the latter appear to be urbane and educated, shows us that this is a norm and a value that not only is accepted in the film's universe, but due to the proximity of that universe to that of our own reality, is projected by the film onto us. A real-life connection takes us to Ernest Hemingway, who, like many writers, was also a journalist and as such not only documented the Spanish Civil War, but also accompanied the US forces during the campaign in Northwest Europe. It's during that time and in his capacity as a journalist that he was rumored to have executed a captured SS man. Journalistic objectivity is already very hard to find, and most reports will carry an agenda beneficial to a particular side or another. Journalists becoming actors, perpetrators, and accomplices is a whole different level, and that helps us to understand the atmosphere in the film, where we hear complaints that journalists are considered as legitimate targets by the government-aligned forces, something that we see when the sniper shoots at the press-marked vehicle, as well as when the racist militiaman carries out his executions. This mirrors the real-life acrimony between Donald Trump and the majority of news outlets that aligned themselves against him, conflict that led to the spread of the label fake news. The film culminates and ends with the fall of Washington, D.C. Most of the loyalist US military have betrayed their president. They chose to leave the fight zone. The narcissistic president is oblivious to that, so the Western forces thus move on the capital, opposed only by the few fanatical loyalist units remaining, as well as the Secret Service. The White House is stormed, and the administration attempts to negotiate a safe passage to a neutral territory. There are laws and customs governing such interactions, white flags, negotiators, truces, etc. The government's negotiator should be met by an official or officer of superior rank. This is how the original US Civil War ended. This is how the Third Reich ended. In this story, the president's unarmed emissary attempts to negotiate a safe passage, but is shot outright by a team of soldiers. The killing happens again under the eyes of journalists. Furthermore, the soldiers manage to capture the president alive. This is a tyrant, and we expect him to be tried for whatever crimes he had committed or ordered. But no, everybody rushes to execute him. The English and French revolutions had regicides that followed trials. Napoleon got exiled, as were many defeated heads of state. Some others were outright spared. The Allies, including the Soviet Union, went out of their way to preserve the lives of captured, high-ranking Nazi war criminals, some of whom were executed after trials later. Communist China tried Emperor Puyi, and he went on to become a gardener. Pol Pot was tried and went to prison. Why wouldn't the good guys go down the legal route? Sometimes the judicial processes were there only to legitimize an execution that had been decided beforehand. But the judicial processes were still there. Saddam Hussein was tried by the new Iraqi government. Ceausescu of Romania had an express show trial. The only exceptions were the likes of Mussolini and Gaddafi, or that guy buried at sea. But such occurrences didn't add legitimacy to those who killed them. It doesn't occur to any of the soldiers that a superior officer should be present. None of the journalists try to stop them. The journalist who had set on an epic journey that saw several of his colleagues perish, with the specific task of interviewing the president, doesn't protest at his arbitrary execution, and instead of an interview is content to record the plea not to be killed as famous last words. This makes the film's message rather ominous. and it is worrying that this work has plenty of potential to become prophetic or perhaps inspiring in view of the continuing tensions that it contributed to fuel, not only in the United States but all over the Anglosphere. Throughout the centuries, the English-speaking peoples, as that famous Anglo-American Winston Churchill called them, have gone through several civil wars that included the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, also known as the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the American War of Independence, the War of Secession, and the multiple and long conflicts surrounding Ireland. The English-speaking peoples have historically been rather bellicose and quite efficient at wars, both outwardly and inwardly, and we must hope that people will think things through, that democracy and respect for its processes and choices of the people will continue to flourish, and that there will be a turn away from identity politics, that people will try to be more objective, less polarized, and better educated, and make better use of their common sense, that quintessential quality of the English-speaking peoples, and that thus new cycles of violence will be averted. What do you think about it? An interesting detail surrounding the film is that its director Alex Garland is British, and that this work of his is prescient of the present schism that is taking place between the Trump-led America and Britain, especially over the war in Ukraine. An indicator of Britain's power in the film is that its offshoot of Canada is unaffected by it, to the point of retaining a solid currency. That there still is a Hong Kong and a Reuters, and that the TV reporter at the end is played by a British actress, speaking in an English accent. Another interesting detail is that one of the main characters, Lee, the older photojournalist, first has a name that's the surname of the main commander of the losing side in the original American Civil War. Second, she's killed at the White House shortly before the president. And we may remember that a president, especially this type of president, is a kind of monarch, a king if you will. And that Kirsten Dunst, who portrays Lee, had previously played the role of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, who, just like her husband King Louis XVI, was executed during the French Revolution in a similar act of regicide. This is a bit of coincidental symbolism, such as we will show you more on this channel. So please like, share, subscribe, and give us your thoughts and questions by joining the discussion while observing the laws and conventions of civilized and constructive commentary and dialogue. Thank you, and see you soon.